Good day, and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Andrew Wu, and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Mainstreaming Natural Capital into Decision Making: Frontiers in Research and Policy. The Yale Center for Business and the Environment is pleased to continue Nature's Returns, a webinar series that addresses the growing importance of ecosystem service valuation and investment. Each presentation is recorded and available on the Yale iTunes U channel. We are pleased to have Professor Gretchen Daily here with us today. Gretchen Daily is the Bing Professor of Environmental Science at Stanford University. Daly also serves as Faculty Director of the Natural Capital Project, an international partnership whose goal is to enhance social and environmental well-being by mainstreaming the values of nature into global resource decisions. An ecologist by training, Daly's efforts span fundamental research and policy and business-oriented demonstrations in over 30 nations. Her recent books include The Power of Trees, Natural Capital: Theory and Practice of Mapping Ecosystem Services, and The New Economy of Nature: The Quest to Make Conservation Profitable. Today, Daly will present the Natural Capital Project and its practical, science-based approach towards ecosystem service valuation. Aside from highlighting the partnership's overarching mission and the tools developed to realize its vision, Gretchen will also explore projects where the Natural Capital Project's work has influenced decision-making around the world. Before we begin the presentation, we would like to remind our listeners that questions are welcomed and will be directed to our speaker at the conclusion of the talk. You can type questions directly into the GoToMeeting chat window. And with that, we welcome Gretchen Daly to Nature's Returns.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining here. I'm actually over in Stockholm just now, so it's dark, but it's a great place to be for the innovation that's happening in this realm. I'm based at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for my first ever leave from Stanford. And this is the place where a lot of the foundation was laid for integrating ecology and economics and other realms of inquiry and thought, such as governance, resilience, and other kind of big ideas, to provide the basis for creating really actionable tools and approaches that bring all these ideas into practice in an effective way. So anyhow, it's a pleasure to join. I thank Andrew and Karina for inviting me and helping me set everything up. And I had thought I was just going to be interacting with a modest-sized class at Yale, and I didn't realize there'd be quite a few people joining from all over and from many very experienced areas. So I'm going to shift a little bit what I was planning to cover, but what I'd love to do is open enough time for a discussion. I'll be kind of watching this chat box as best I can. And if questions come up during, I'll see if I can address those. And otherwise, I'll just end promptly by quarter of so that we have a decent amount of time to interact over like the frontiers here. So I'm also going to give a little bit of a personal view. There's so many ways to get into these issues, and I thought, well, I might as well get into them in the way I'm most experienced just for our discussion. And I'd love to hear from you kind of from a personal perspective where you're sitting and wrestling with the challenges we all face, whether here on the webinar or afterward by email. So anyway, thanks, and let's dive in. I guess for me this goes way back, but I'll start maybe with my mentor, Hal Mooney, who was a co-chair of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, this big process involving thousands of scientists trying to inform policymakers worldwide, both in private and public sectors, of the importance of ecosystems. And that was an unprecedented effort and kind of the first ever to really assess natural capital. I'm going to use terms like that, and I know they're all it's all a matter of debate, and it would be best discussed maybe over a beer, which exact terms to use. But we were trying to come together with the economics community at the time, and we knew a lot about other kinds of capital, and over actually thousands of years have developed institutions for thinking about and more formally trying to safeguard other types of capital, such as built capital or infrastructure, things like our homes and automobiles or bicycles, computers, and so on. Human capital, our knowledge and skills and health, financial capital, and social capital. Yet, looking at this slide here in the opening, we knew next to nothing. We're really at the infancy in human history of considering natural capital, at least at kind of the global interconnected scale that demands our attention today. So 10 years ago, we founded the Natural Capital Project to start trying to accelerate the rate of innovation and inquiry and uptake of kind of new understanding about the values of the ecosystem you see in the background. So in the foreground, we've got a tea plantation in Uganda, and obviously no place is managed perfectly in the world, but we know a lot about the value of that plantation from the perspective of the people working in it, the people packaging up and marketing the tea and selling it all over the world, the government officials trying to regulate what goes on in there, and so on. Yet we know next to nothing about that cloud forest in the background and what it means, how much it's worth in different dimensions to people whose lives, whether we think consciously about it or not, are connected to that cloud forest. So it was from that kind of launching point 10 years ago that a few of us, basically some friends, we've always called ourselves the amigos, got together to try and achieve that acceleration, but also span the gulf between kind of development of new knowledge and actually adapting that knowledge and taking it up in real decision making. So the friends were Taylor Ricketts, who had been a student with me and others at Stanford, and Peter Kariva. Taylor had just moved to World Wildlife Fund and was heading up the big science shop there, and Peter Kariva was at the Nature Conservancy, where I was just joining the board, and it was really exciting as a moment to begin trying to span this gulf between sort of theory and practice. So in thinking strategically about what to do, we came up with these 4 main objectives, and pretty soon we realized we desperately needed the expertise of people at University of Minnesota, and those at the time were Steve Pulaski, who's still deeply involved, and John Foley, who's since moved on, but formed a core part of this core team of what is really a global partnership with efforts at moving into practice these different kind of realms, 1 through 4 here. Number 1, co-developing new knowledge. Number 2, co-developing, in both cases with users, really practical, actionable tools for bringing the knowledge into real-world decision-making. And then taking the leap and actually implementing these approaches and tools in decision-making. And finally, in selecting our engagements throughout, we've been really focused on opportunity to scale up. So there's a big open question here. Maybe I'll flag a few questions as we go on, and would love to hear your perspective on them. But how much can we expect to be able to take models of success and replicate and scale them? That's, I think, an outstanding question, but it's something we're driving toward, hopefully in a sensible way, knowing that every place is different, but at the same time, if we can develop some standardized approaches that seem to work well under a lot of conditions, we can achieve the transformation to more sustainable living that we're all reaching for a lot more quickly. So these were the frontiers, and I'm going to dive in and just tell kind of basically a story about each, and then open up for discussion. But on the general kind of conceptual front, this will be my only real conceptual slide. What we want to do is change the way people think about options, identifying alternatives at the top in yellow. And then this diagram just shows, obviously you could put arrows in any direction and across any of the little ovals, but the idea here was to see if we could develop tools and approaches that would illuminate how the different alternatives would affect ecosystems, how those impacts on ecosystem condition and like processes would translate into changes in the delivery of services. And then this is a tough one. How would change in provision of different services translate into human well-being? And then, of course, we want to work through institutions, sort of transmitting this understanding and information in a way that would motivate better decision-making and enable better decision-making. So in the first part of this, with this little purple wavy arrow, we recognized that with the Millennium Assessment had gone a long way in showing just how much was known, about the status and trends of ecosystems, this form of living natural capital, and the provision of different types of services. But we also very humbly recognize how little we know. We're really just sort of chipping away at the tip of the iceberg here when it comes to human dependence and impacts on the natural world. So a key frontier that all of us, I imagine, are focused on is just co-development of knowledge that's relevant to some of the big challenges around the world. And the one I'm highlighting here, on which my group has focused for a couple of decades now, is just, how could we harmonize agricultural production and livelihoods with, for example, rainforest protection. And here's a shot of a little bit of rainforest in the thick of pasture and coffee production in a southern part of Costa Rica. That is one of my favorite haunts. And what are the values at stake here for local people making a living on the land? Over quite a few years, and starting with actually part of Taylor Ricketts' postdoctoral work, we've tried to quantify, what are the inputs from rainforest into agricultural production. And we started out looking at pollination with the little bee on the left to coffee. Those are coffee blossoms you see there. And then moved to looking at pest control. There's this devastating pest on coffee for which the coffee berry borer wiping out up to 80% of yield in places. It's moving around the world right now where it's heavily infested, and no real effective control of any form, like chemical control. So looking at natural forms of pest control by birds and bats. And just to give you a taste of this, so Taylor ended up becoming quite famous for finding, first of all, that even these little bits of forest can confer a boost in yield of 20% in nearby areas, like within a few hundred meters, maybe up to a kilometer from forest. Bees aren't going to fly forever. And they also confer, in this one study, a 50% boost in quality. So those were a big deal, where the margins, the profit margins, are really slim. And this attracted quite a bit of attention. It's one farm, but it was a new way of thinking about nature in the midst of farming activity and livelihoods. And then recently, Danny Karp, who's now a NatureNet fellow with the Nature Conservancy, he did this painstaking work, equally painstaking. And I've got to tell you, like, guess how many bees, first of all, are out in a typical coffee plantation like this? We found, there are millions and millions of individuals, but over 700 different species within just a month's sampling. And I'm sure we didn't, find them all. Similarly with birds, there are more than 250 that are pretty commonly out in these coffee plantations. And among the bats, it's hard to catch them all. A lot of them are really good at evading us, but there's at least about 70 out there potentially suppressing insects. So with a lot of painstaking work, we found that birds suppress infestation by 50% in this area shown. With bats, it's a much more complicated story where they eat both the beneficial insects that also maybe help control some of these pests, and also the enemies of farmers that maybe you want to get rid of. So this just, I'm giving you to make a couple of points. One is that with, there were painstaking studies, but pretty quickly we could open up a new window into how nature in a sea of farmland interacts with farmers and livelihoods with real economic values at stake. And another thing we found, I guess, is just to say that it's humbling. There's so many different types of interactions out there. And again, we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg and trying to understand how pollination services, for example, are provided across the world's agricultural systems, and the same with, say, natural pest control services. But what can we do? There's now been about, some thousands of studies over the past decade with many, many different research groups applying many approaches to understanding many different types of ecosystem processes and services. What can we do to build on these individual studies rather than saying, okay, we're going to wait till we understand it all, to inform policy in a responsible way? What we wanted to do in addressing this was just start building a new way of thinking in the form of practical tools that even with all the uncertainty that we have in human dependence and impacts on nature, would nonetheless inform our decisions. Is better than flying blind. So for this part of kind of the aims in this conceptual figure, we're trying to link ecosystems to human well-being, the conditions and processes in ecosystems, their biodiversity and other things. How do those generate services and impact human well-being? So obviously there's a whole range of things we could consider here. Some would be relatively concrete, like food. We know a lot about it, and we've gotten good over the past 10,000 years as a species at producing it under all sorts of conditions. And then happiness, which hopefully we're all pretty good at, but it's a much less concrete thing and harder to know across a society how to embed conditions for happiness into policy. But what we wanted to do is start broadly and develop some things that were really practical, and I'll kind of review where we are today. So we started out a few years back, maybe right at the beginning actually, behind the scenes, developing models that start, if you look at the upper left corner of the slide, with basically land cover, or in marine systems, what's going on across a seascape. And with that, relate land cover to provision of different types of benefits like flood control or carbon sequestration, agricultural production, or biodiversity as an attribute of the landscape. And we put this set of models that we were starting to develop, building on huge amounts of work that have been done in some of these fields, especially in hydrology, carbon dynamics, agriculture, and integrate them into one system, INVEST, for integrated valuation of ecosystem services and the many trade-offs involved in, say, any landscape or any seascape. You're never going to get it all. So the idea was to actually use this tool in scenarios, whether kind of at a huge scale, asking how ecosystem service values would change with climate disruption or shifts in the distribution and numbers of people, urbanization especially, or with new types of policies. And then getting right down to business on the ground, asking, for example, for this part of the Central Valley in California where most native habitat disappeared a long time ago, how would restoration of this riparian area affect agricultural income, drinking water quality, carbon sequestration, and so on? Similarly, in a coastal area, how would restoration of seagrass beds, say, influence nursery habitats and thereby fishing income, erosion and flooding and risks associated with that, recreation, biodiversity? So that was the context. And together with some hundreds of scientists from all over the world, starting out at NCs, where Peter Kariva had really good connections, we just got to work mostly in simplifying models. Some of our models are new, like I'm trying to even think, I guess kind of some of the crop pollination modeling was new, but a lot of these models we took from existing, much more complex and very data intensive fields, or modeling that had been developed in specialized fields. And we tried to make the models more accessible without making them just completely inaccurate and worthless. But the whole goal here was to be able to inform conservation efforts worldwide. So we're linked up tightly with TNC and WWF. And we needed to be able to use data that are available worldwide and work with decision makers and capacity that exists worldwide to start integrating this thinking into decision making. So this is kind of the suite of models, with the more terrestrial models in green, the more aquatic ones over in blue, and then a bunch that apply to both. And I'll just give you a taste of how they work in a minute here. But the idea also was to link ecosystem change, not only when we talk about valuation, not only to impacts in monetary metrics, but looking at a lot of different metrics. We haven't gotten that far in this yet, although there are a lot of really nice frontiers opening up. But at one level, we were this is another thing good to talk over. I'm actually not that into beer, but so to speak, over beer. How do we describe the link between ecosystem changes in services, and human well-being? There are a lot of different ways we'd want to be able to understand the links. And it was kind of to our relief that the decision makers with whom we started working actually didn't want us to convert everything into a monetary, say, a dollar metric. So let me dive in and explain what we actually did. And I'm going to give you, before I do that, sorry, I have a terrific student, Greg Bratman, working on the mental health dimension of this. And I just want to take a tiny aside here, because I was just so surprised to see what this field is doing. So I've gotten into it only a little bit through Greg Bratman and James Gross and others advising him. But there's much more going on there than I had appreciated before. So let's dive in just quickly. We all know that we're urbanizing, in this just unprecedented situation worldwide, with over half of humanity in cities today, and up to 70–75% expected to be in cities by 2050. And city living, it's also very well documented that while there are many benefits associated with city living, there's also some real health risks. One of them is an increase in anxiety disorders of 20% over living in rural areas, and a 40% increase in mood disorders, especially related to depression. Why is that? And it turns out there are actually a lot of people, this was reported in The Economist in the summer in 2011, and through a Nature article that, if you're into this, I highly recommend, by a German group, Lederbogen, and one of the main people is Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg, who've written a lot about this and done a lot of experiments. And they discovered, using these new brain imaging approaches, that you can actually pretty much tell where someone was raised between the ages of 0 and 5 and where they live today on the basis of their stress response. The brain in the area that kind of gets cemented in, so to speak, when you're a real youngster, is much more active among urban people when they're stressed than it is among rural people raised in rural areas when they were between the ages of 0 and 5. And then similarly, in the part of the brain that remains, so to speak, more flexible today, the amygdala, people respond. There's much more blood flow, sort of highlighted here, to that region when stressed in one of these machines, if you're currently living in a city than if you're from a more rural area. That's just one dimension of a huge body of work here. I'm going to show another dimension that Greg Bratman's developing. And this here, the pictures just show the Stanford campus with this little nice hybrid shuttle bus that takes unsuspecting volunteers who think they're taking a walk and just taking a bunch of pictures. That's what they're instructed to do. It's like a 45-minute walk in either this pretty nice looking oak woodland grassland area shown on the right. That's one of the pictures taken by a subject. Or down on El Camino, if you know the campus at all. In the bottom photo, it's kind of an 8-lane, 4 lanes each side, some places 5 lanes, very busy thoroughfare. Both are about a 10 to 15-minute drive from the campus. And it's amazing what that 45-minute walk will do to you. If you measure people's cognitive performance before and after the walk, as well as aspects of their mood, you get striking results. And this is new, and it's not formatted perfectly for here. I just threw it in, but hope you will forgive me. The preliminary results, actually, it's just gotten into press, so I should take away preliminary, but that happened a week ago. If you look at working memory, how well you can recall weird things that psychology experiments make you remember, anxiety, rumination, which is the tendency to sort of have these terrible negative thoughts about all the idiotic things you've done in life, and then kind of connection to nature, which is how much are you just obsessing about yourself and all your hang-ups and mistakes versus feeling kind of connected to the broader biosphere. You get a striking difference. Just compare the bars, urban and brown, nature and green in each graph. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but working memory improves, your anxiety or stress goes down, your rumination goes down, and your connectedness to nature goes up if you've been lucky enough to get assigned to the 45-minute nature walk. So this sort of thing, there's actually a lot of work in this area, and maybe some of you know much more about it. And we're trying to figure out, how to bring this into urban planning. There are a lot of cities interested in doing so and starting to do so, and into thinking about child development and things. But taking these different areas and recognizing that we know some pretty darned well, and others we're just kind of opening up as new knowledge frontiers, we've created a suite of models that are free and downloadable here at this website and described in kind of pretty theoretical form here in this book. And by the way, for any of the students, I have some extra copies still, and I'd be happy to send some if you email me. But going from there, the big challenge is, okay, so we've got these tools. Now, how are a bunch of little computer tools going to save the world? You can easily get cynical about that. A bunch of people, partly based in Silicon Valley, overrating the potential for, software-based approaches to do anything. So let's just dive into this. I worry a lot about what our best pathways to impact are, so to speak, in trying to drive change here. So how far have we gotten in implementing? Well, first I'm going to tell you about moving from this understanding through institutions to identifying a bunch of alternatives and actually informing decisions in one of our very first sort of demonstrations, and that was in Hawaii. And I want to get a few things across here. And one is, oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is a suite of sites in which we work today, just to give you a taste of it. But like I said, I want to focus initially on Hawaii, and then we'll turn to Latin America and China. And one of the key points is just that in all of the places, it says I might be experiencing network difficulties. So hopefully someone will interrupt me here if things are going south. But I'll continue unless interrupted. So in Hawaii, and in all these places, we've had 3 criteria for engaging. And number 1 was just that we were invited into some kind of policy window of opportunity to inform a decision. So that was nice, and it was basically relatively easy through our wonderful partnerships with the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund, with people situated in offices all over the world and working out in the context of land use, marine system management and everything. We had a lot of great opportunities, but one of the first that came along was with, I'll just dive into it now, with Kamehameha Schools. This was right at the beginning, and the head of Kamehameha Schools Land Assets Division, Neil Hannes, happened to get his degree at Stanford and had close connections and a lot of trust, and brought us basically a policy window of opportunity. The second and third criteria for engaging in places were strength and commitment, basically among necessary partners. Hard to judge that always, but we're trying to be really inclusive, strategically inclusive in all of these engagements. And then third, that I mentioned this earlier, that there was some potential for replicating and scaling any approach we might hope to be successful with. So here in Hawaii, many people don't know Kamehameha Schools, but it's the biggest private trust in the United States. It was born out of a terrible history at the end of the monarchy, when Westerners were pouring in from Europe and North America, pushing Native Hawaiians off the land. Over 90%, it's estimated, of Native Hawaiians perished during this period in the mid-1800s, late 1800s, and into the 20th century. And the last princess in the Kamehameha line, Princess Pauahi Bishop, actually inherited the land shown in blue. And if you've been to Hawaii, you'll recognize that this is some of the best land, most prime land across the islands. And she inherited it from her many relatives who were perishing of disease during that time. And interestingly, she was married to an educator and decided, this is boiling a complex story down to a few sentences, but decided to create a trust so that her legacy would be trying to rebuild Hawaiian culture and build capacity among Hawaiian people to live in what back then was becoming a very globalized world all of a sudden. So she set up this trust, and the trust for over 100 years managed assets in a way illustrated by this slide showing Waikiki, developing some of that prime land in ways that actually it conferred a lot of kind of standard straight economic value, commercial real estate value and such, but wiped out most of the cultural, natural, and other values that Native Hawaiians had held really dear. So again, boiling the story down far too quickly, there was a lot of resistance to this among the Native Hawaiian community. And finally, around the year 2000, the board of Kamehameha Schools was sacked, and a new board came in saying, okay, we're going to launch a new approach, trying to balance economic value. Obviously we have to measure it in some ways, and there are lawyers in Chicago and LA breathing down our necks to make sure that we meet the fiduciary responsibilities of the trust. But we want to integrate environmental dimensions of value, cultural dimensions of value, educational and community dimensions. They became very formal in defining these different dimensions in measurable ways that I don't have time to get into here, but I'd be happy to follow up with. And when we got together, it was a matter of what to do with this incredible land holding on the north shore of Oahu. I'm going to go back, that bit circled in red right there. So about 10,000 hectares of land, some of the last undeveloped farmland in Hawaii, and there's a huge food security issue there with just a few days food supply on the island really at any one time. Some of the last undeveloped coastline on Oahu, and other incredible cultural assets at stake. So after working for basically a couple of years in a very iterative process with different key local stakeholders, 3 main scenarios emerged as desirable for evaluating for kind of the future of this land. Developing housing to address the huge inequities in housing and other aspects of well-being among Native Hawaiians and the many people who've moved in from elsewhere. Addressing sort of the energy security issues, which are huge, and growing a biomass feedstock. There's a lot of experience in there, sugarcane likely. And third, addressing the food security issues and growing local food, and there's also forestry involved here. So here's how the process worked of just using invest models in the context of this charged and historically very I don't know the right words to capture this really briefly, but there are a lot of issues going on here, and it wasn't just going to be a matter of the invest models saying, oh, this is what you should do. But in this context, getting to know people, working in a process, we evaluated across the 10,000 hectares, what would the landscape look like? Were it dedicated mostly to sugar production with forest and native biodiversity still in the lower right corner, in the upper reaches of that watershed, still in forest, looking at the residential development, and then finally at food crops for local markets and reforestation of a native tree, koa, which is very highly valued in cultural and economic terms. And what you can see, the invest outputs, this is just to give you a taste again, show the different, whether you're going to get an increase or a decrease over this 20-year planning horizon across. We only had 3 services that we were modeling back then. And here's what it's easier to see it all on this display with arrows, what the relative merits were of the different approaches, and all had an expected, positive return to income. And by the way, this was led by Josh Goldstein, a postdoc then. He's now at the Nature Conservancy. But overall, the better balance, given the new approach, was to be attained through agriculture and forestry. And so Kamehameha Schools actually committed to investing over the long term in diversifying agriculture and forestry to achieve this balance. And sorry to jump ahead, I'm going to speed up a little bit. And with that, I just want to touch on another key part to this, and then I'll be much quicker in the next examples. But there are other frontiers here, and one has to do with integrating different kind of ways of knowing things through the natural, social, and social sciences and the humanities, concerning how things work, what's possible, and what really matters and what is fair. And how could we shift the way things are done today, the social, ecological system, the people, and the ecosystems, and how obviously been tightly interlinked over years and years. And to think about that, getting into, well, what are the meanings and values today for local residents? So another leader in this effort, Rochelle Gould, together with all of our Hawaiian partners, posed this bigger question, how could we elicit and shift values in a way that informs decision making to achieve that more desired balance? There are a couple of papers just out on this. I just kind of wanted to flag them and flag one tiny piece of the analysis that resulted from a lot of work here that concerns how ecosystems are used and identity or sense of self. And here, just taking quotes from the many interviews that were conducted, you can see in the case of this Hawaiian man in his 50s, my identity and the ecosystem are kind of one and the same. For me anyway, the ecosystem is what has made my identity. It's what has made me who I am. Another Hawaiian man quoted as saying, Hawaiians without land cannot be Hawaiians. These are pretty powerful perspectives of identity and the ecosystem. And here, a Japanese man, lifelong resident of Hawaii, reporting something similar, that the ability to farm or fish or to gather or to make food together, to hunt, it's hard to explain who you are, but it's the practices that go with it, the interaction with family, observing a place and weather and times to go hunting and to go fishing. And I read these out just because I wanted to highlight frontiers, and this is a really key knowledge frontier. And then contrasting with a white man who's a resident for 5 years now in Hawaii, saying, well, I don't really feel that identity is necessarily tied too much to places. So at one level, we're talking about these software-based models for projecting changes in services and human well-being. And at another level, there are these other approaches that I feel anyway need to be developed further and to bring more of this to light, since ultimately the way we participate in a decision-making process and the way we engage or hope to give voice to our values is pretty tightly linked to how we think of ourselves. So I just wanted to touch on this, and this came into the Hawaiian context really strongly. But these three contrasting sort of perspectives. So anyhow, they've moved ahead with this really inspiring plan. I won't detail all of it. It involves wind energy on top of the other things I mentioned, and they won a major award for it from the American Planning Association in 2013. But what I'd like to do is, that was an early case, and I just wanted to give you a deeper sense of how that flowed. But now raise this complex question of whether we can replicate and scale anything we declare as a model of success, a process, and a set of actionable tools and things. So I'm going to dive into this with two examples from Latin America and China. And the Latin America case concerns water security above all else. And just to go through it a bit more quickly, it's about shining a light on the connections between how upstream landholders deliver or influence the delivery, I should say, of water downstream, the quantity of water, the quality of water, and the timing of flow, in particular, whether there's flooding or whether there's dry season, complete loss of flow or low flow, depends critically on how upstream areas are managed. So shining a light on that and relating the connections to the many downstream consumers or beneficiaries of this provision of water related benefits. That's the aim. And this is all in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and the Inter-American Development Bank, among other partners. And the idea here is just to figure out the science piece, the biophysical piece, is to figure out what sorts of investments, targeted where in the watershed, what kinds of activities, whether in the top left, protecting existing native habitat there, it's forest, replanting native habitat, or just introducing better management practices in agricultural systems, what would achieve improvements in water security for millions of people living downstream of these huge upstream areas across Latin America? So a really big question that pervades not only Latin America, but the world. But with a lot of leadership in Latin America, there's been development of a pretty standardized approach now, taking in these biophysical data with stakeholder preferences, identifying on the map in this blob that's a watershed where there's high probability of being able to engage local farmers and ranchers in a change in how land is managed, and where it's not a good idea to go, ranking different activities like fencing or conservation or these best management practices, reforestation, together with costs. What would it cost to, this is where dollars do come in. You know, somebody's making an investment here. How do you get the highest return on that investment? So you're not valuing water really as an input to human well-being. You're just asking, well, what would it cost to implement different strategies across the landscape to improve access to high quality, abundant water? And then you get an investment portfolio of where you could target those dollars to achieve an improvement, and how. And this approach, we've now tried to tailor in the invest models in a somewhat different tool in this family of tools called RIOS that brings in the eco-hydrology together with some of the sort of the economics, and then working with the Inter-American Development Bank and a suite of other partners through the Nature Conservancy, the financing, the governance of these water funds, and monitoring of a bunch of them over the long term that's just initiating now. And it's amazing, over the past few years, starting in Ecuador, really, and then Colombia, we're now seeing scaling up to over 40 funds across Latin America today, and also some testing in 3 places in East Africa, and actually some action in the United States and Canada. So that's a sum of an approach that has a lot of potential and looks exciting, and same in China. And I'm sorry I'm going on. I'm going to summarize China all too quickly, but the policy window in China is just staggering to see today. The state council, the president and premier and main body governing the country, has declared China's dream as becoming the ecological civilization of the 21st century. And everybody is well aware of all the stuff we read in the Western news about the dire environmental problems in China. And in fact, so aware that decision makers are saying, okay, well, you tell us, scientists, where and what should we protect in order to harmonize people and nature? And China actually launched one of the first and by far and away the biggest payment for ecosystem service program in the world. And you can see on the map here, there's 120 million households that were enrolled. This was after massive flooding along the Yangtze River, primarily. And this Grain to Green program and the Natural Forest Conservation Program in the dark green basically get payments as part of a wealth transfer program. You could think of it from the eastern provinces to the western inner parts of the country and the northern part of the country. And today, just in the past few years, a new approach has been launched that involves zoning the entire country using the invest models and other models. And these invest models were really co-developed and immensely improved with tight collaboration, especially in hydrology and other areas, with scientists in China. We've seen policymakers zone the country at the national level, it's zoned at each scale down to kind of the provincial and county scale. But for these nationally critical ecosystem services. And we've been, the Natural Capital Project, asked to kind of demonstrate, well, how would you put this kind of understanding of which places are most important for securing, say, water resources or helping with air quality and sandstorm control. And interestingly, biodiversity is weighted equally among these top priority services, as a condition of ecosystems across the country. So we've been given these 3 places, very high profile policy contexts concerning water supplied in the north of China, and then Hainan Island, a real biodiversity hotspot globally. And in all cases, the model is to understand who are the beneficiaries of services in the top right, and ensuring that they're investing through, in fund flow in the livelihoods and activities and well-being of providers of ecosystem services in the top left. And through that investment, that we're achieving sustainable changes in livelihoods, in activities of, and you could say production and consumption. And this involves a lot of understanding. All of the work involves, like I mentioned in Hawaii, a lot of social science frontiers, understanding how people are making a living today and how these policies would impact their livelihoods, and ensuring that dual goals are achieved of poverty alleviation together with securing natural capital and sort of national security, as people put it. So I'm actually not going to go through this. There's a nice paper in PNAS led by Professor Chung Hua at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, showing how this was implemented to secure water, the only surface water source for Beijing, Miyun Watershed just north of the city. And you can see it there. I'll go over it super quickly. Basically, increasing population in Beijing, going way up, declining inflow of water over the decades, increasing pollution from industry, other wastewater, and agriculture. And then looking at this framework, figuring out, well, how to pay providers. And these were rice farmers as of a couple hundred years, when in one of the dynasties, land use changed dramatically in this area. And getting people to shift to dryland agriculture or to other kinds of livelihoods. And basically there was a massive change within a 5-year period, and water yield has gone up, total nitrogen and total phosphorus have gone down. And now they're really fine-tuning this program, expecting to achieve even more of a sort of win-win for livelihoods and water security. But the last thing I'll mention is just this final sort of big advance being made in China now is to actually forget about trying to green GDP, which has been this multi-decade effort on the part of many people worldwide that's politically quite fraught, and to instead introduce a separate metric called gross ecosystem product that measures the total value of ecosystem goods and services supplied annually by an area. It could be a county or a province or a municipality or the whole country. This is to be reported alongside GDP, to be made very public, and to generate incentives for achieving a high GEP and also pressure to achieve that high GEP. And it was approved about a year ago and now is in rapid development. So let me just close now in saying that there are a lot of frontiers here, a lot of challenges ahead, and a lot of other efforts have come up over the past 10 years that are key to standardizing approaches, making the approaches a lot better tailored to particular kinds of decisions in businesses. I didn't get into the corporate engagements that we have with Coke and Dow and Unilever, but we're working closely with the Natural Capital Protocol, a key effort led by the WBCSD and others to provide a guidance for executives and other stakeholders, and focusing more effort on these key decision contexts here that I'll end with, to advance on all of these frontiers and develop next generation sort of demonstrations that go a lot further in achieving the ultimate outcomes of improving both livelihoods and securing natural capital. And I apologize, I didn't mean to go on as long as I did, but I'll stop now and just thank you for your patience, and would really welcome any exchange we can have now, and then later, I guess, over email or other ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Gretchen. Can you hear me? We have time for 2 questions from audience members that we would appreciate your input on. Andrew asks, when simplifying current biophysical models, how did the project team decide how much simplification was appropriate and how to quantify modeling uncertainty for the INVEST tool?
Thanks, Andrew. You've asked a really key question, and I'll just give a brief answer here. First, we decided to develop 3 tiers of modeling of different levels of complexity and with different data requirements. So we had a very simple tier where you could just look at sort of relative impacts of different scenarios or choices on a landscape or seascape and the provision of services, through to a much more complex tier where you could actually use results from a SWOT model or some other very complex hydrology or other model in this integrated framework, and then maybe bring in a pollination model or something like that. So the idea was just to achieve the integration and not fuss too much over the right level of complexity. But that's a big frontier for us, especially in hydrology, since so many of the users of the models are focused on kind of water security and flood risk and things like that. So we are seeing a lot more work in this area. There's a nice article led by Drew Guswa in, I think, Water Policy Research, and it kind of lays out some of these frontiers. But the key is next, the big focus is to both simplify, so that, say in hydrology, you're focusing on the output that a decision maker most needs for in a particular decision context, rather than on the entire set of hydrologic processes going on in the system. And then second, so that you are reporting uncertainty in a way that's most useful in that particular decision context. So we're really tailoring things and trying to lose information that isn't so critical to the particular decision at hand, but deepen understanding and illuminate what's going on in terms of uncertainty and key aspects of hydrologic processes like peak flow, and flood risk, that kind of thing, or certain aspects, are you going to hit a minimum flow period of so many days in the dry season, that kind of thing. So that's a general answer, but both of your questions are spot on in terms of modeling frontiers.
Great, thank you, Gretchen. The second question comes from Nancy, who asks, you mentioned this toward the end, but how and where do you see private enterprise and entrepreneurship advancing the goals of the Natural Capital Project?
So we've seen interest in a lot of different areas, and I show here actually some of the key areas. So in the context of water security, there are many different types of firms that are interested, and we're working with Coca-Cola and with Unilever partly on number 1, as well as many, hydropower firms in the context of some of the water fund work in Latin America. Hydropower is one major consumer in the context of those water funds, and it's usually private firms running businesses. In the context of commodity supply chains and securing those supply chains, there's a huge amount of interest and leadership. In the context of infrastructure design and investment. We've mostly been working there with the Latin American Development Bank, but they're connected to many, private sector firms that make these investments and that actually implement them. And then in the context of coastal resilience and protection, a key interesting example is Dow Chemical, where through the Nature Conservancy, again, we've been engaged in looking at their huge assets, most of which sit along coastlines for shipping purposes and along, at river mouths. So we've been working with Dow at looking at the implications of alternative siting choices for infrastructure in the future, and at how to protect existing infrastructure that by chance is subject to, in the Gulf of Mexico, to really high hurricane return frequencies. And similarly in sustainable cities, we haven't yet, I got number 7 there is corporate reporting. We haven't yet gotten into this as much as we would eventually like. It's just a trickier area. And I won't get into why now because we're short on time, but it's a lot trickier to reveal what is going on at a kind of sector-wide level, comparing corporations in their dependence and impacts on different natural capital assets. But that is a really key frontier. So there's also maybe one last thing among industry leaders, a lot of movement toward better practices and these roundtables on commodities, or work with the Natural Capital Coalition and the Natural Capital Declaration and Protocol, a drive toward developing some standards and understanding which kinds of tools could be most useful in which kinds of decision contexts, and how to foster development of those tools and approaches in a way that's most effective and accelerates uptake. So there has been a lot of opportunity and interest and leadership, and we're really keen. Maybe a final thing here, we're actually developing a data analytics and visualization platform with Microsoft that will, in our dream, we're just getting going on this, make widely available and freely available the core basic data that you need to conduct these sorts of analyses, and visualize the implications of alternative decisions or choices in a platform that we will make open to the global community for featuring different types of tools that eventually will be highly interoperable, and featuring also kind of demonstrations of how to achieve the change that we're all reaching for. So thanks for that question. And again, I'm sorry I've gone on a bit, but thanks for your attention, and I look forward to being in touch with many of you.
Perfect. Thank you, Gretchen. That concludes the talk on mainstreaming natural capital into decision making. Once again, we would like to thank Gretchen Daily for joining us today. If you wish to review a recording of this webinar, please visit the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website, or access the recording through the Yale iTunes University podcast. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Andrew Wu from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.